Hello, in today's video we'll be repairing this coolant leak coming from the water pump on this Toyota Camry, and we'll also be replacing the timing belt as well. To begin, we want to drain the coolant from the system using the petcock, but you do want to make sure that the engine is cold and has had the radiator cap removed to depressurize the system. We want to rotate this counterclockwise to begin draining the coolant. You'll want to disconnect the negative terminal of the battery and move the cable away to avoid it making contact. To begin removing the alternator, we'll want to disconnect all the electrical. This connection will have a tab you gotta press down to remove the connector, but it's broken in this case. Using a 10mm socket, we can remove this nut to disconnect this cable. Disconnecting this AC connection will let you get the wiring harness completely out of the way. Just press in on this tab and slide off the connector. We'll need a 12mm socket to loosen and remove these two alternator adjuster bolts, and a 14mm socket to loosen and remove the second alternator bolt. Completely remove this first alternator bolt. Removing the second bolt next. And we can now remove the alternator. We'll want to remove the hubcap using a screwdriver or pry bar so we can loosen the wheel. Loosen all 5 lug nuts with a 21mm socket. Now lift the car so the wheel's off the floor and so you can place a jack stand underneath as well. We can now completely remove the wheel. Now with the wheel removed, we can remove the splash shield that's being held on by two 10mm bolts. Now we can move back up top and loosen the two timing cover bolts that also hold in this wire loom in place. And this is the second timing cover bolt that we must loosen. And now we can move this harness up and out of the way. This little ground strap, all we have to do is pull it apart. Now we can remove the two bolts holding this dog bone mount using a 14mm socket. And we can now slide out the mount. We can now continue to remove the bracket for the mount using a 14mm wrench, ratcheting in this case. There's one bolt that attaches it up here and two on the lower side attaching it to the engine block. As you can see, it's better to get to the two bolts from the underside where you remove the splash shield. Once you got the bracket unbolted from the block, we can now remove the bracket from up top, rotating as you slide out. Now we gotta remove the timing cover bolts, the two that we loosened already and the remaining bolts that attach the upper cover. There's one hidden back here which we gotta use a 10mm socket for. There's two more bolts attaching this upper timing cover. Here's one, and this is the other. And now we can pull the upper timing cover off. Here's a look at our timing belt, which looks to be in good shape, but the tension is not where it should be. Next we gotta remove the power steering belt, using a 12mm socket and a long extension. All we gotta do is loosen this one bolt and pull on the belt a little. This will remove tension from the belt. Now we want to put the engine at top dead center using a 19mm socket. There's a small dimple on the harmonic balancer you want to look for, which we want to line up with the 0 on the timing cover. But we also want this camshaft gear hole lined up with the dimple on the rear cover. If you get to the 0 and notice that the camshaft gear hole is towards the bottom, you will have to rotate the bolt one more time around. This is what the camshaft gear lined up with the mark should look like. We now want to loosen and remove the harmonic balancer. I'm using an impact because this bolt is on here really tight. Sometimes you'll get lucky once the bolt's off and the harmonic balancer will just pull off. But not so in this case. To remove the harmonic balancer, I'll be using a puller and 2 long 6mm bolts. You want to install the bolts opposite of each other, and begin tightening the puller. It shouldn't require much force. And just like that, the harmonic balancer is off. We can now use a 10mm socket to remove the remaining lower timing cover bolts. There should be 4 bolts that you gotta remove, including the center one. Once you got all 4 bolts removed, we can slide the timing cover out the bottom. This plate helps keep the timing belt aligned, so you want to make sure to reinstall it. Before removing the timing belt, I like to mark the cam gear and the rear cover. It makes it easier to find the cam's top dead center mark. To make removing the timing belt easier, you want to loosen the tensioner with a 14mm and retighten while pushing on the tensioner so it has less tension on the belt. And we can now remove the timing belt. If you bought the whole timing kit, you can now remove the tensioner pulley plus the spring. The tensioner sits on this dimple, so you gotta make sure when you install the new one. We can also remove the idler pulley using a 14mm. I use a screwdriver tip on a socket to remove the screw on the water pump. Next we want to remove the bolt holding the alternator bracket. Next we can remove these water pump bolts using a 10mm socket. You want to pay attention to the length of the bolts. Some are shorter than the others. Once you got all the water pump bolts removed, you want to separate the water pump from the outlet. I use a screwdriver to help separate it. If you don't have a gasket remover tool, I'm showing you how you can remove it using a blade, which you gotta be careful from cutting yourself and cutting into the surface, so you want to kind of angle it against the surface. To complete cleaning off the surface, you want to use a piece of Scotch-Brite to remove any remaining imperfections. But I'm also going to replace the seals behind the water outlet. So to remove it, you got to use a 10mm wrench to remove these two nuts that attach it to the water pipes. Now that we got both of the nuts removed, we can remove the water outlet completely. Now we want to disconnect the attached radiator hose. If you do remove the water outlet, it does make it a lot easier to clean the water pump surface. This is a timing belt water pump kit that I'll be using. Included is everything you need to replace the timing belt and water pump. It includes the pulleys, gaskets, and the seals. Now to remove the water pipe seal using either a pick or a screwdriver. You want to lift up an edge and slide it off. Before installing the new seal, you want to clean out the crud using a piece of Scotch-Brite. We're now ready to install the new seal. Once installed, you want to give it a light coating of engine oil, so when installing the water outlet it doesn't damage it and slides on easier. We can now install the new water pump. Be sure to install the new gasket and line it up properly beforehand. With the water outlet removed, we're only able to install 3 of the bolts. It's also important to replace this other O-ring for the water outlet, which we want to clean the surface before installing the new seal. And the new O-ring should stay in place with the 3 tabs that it has, but you want to be careful when installing it that it doesn't slide off. And you want to place this last gasket into position for the coolant pipes. The water outlet should slide back into place pretty easy. Just be sure to coat the coolant pipe O-ring beforehand. And you want to watch to make sure that the other O-ring stays in position. Once you got all the water pump bolts installed, you want to bring them down and tighten them in a crisscross pattern. You either want to tighten them with a small ratchet but not too tight, because they can easily break, or you can torque them to spec. And now you want to tighten the 2 nuts for the coolant pipes. This kit will include 2 springs which differ depending on the year and the engine size of the car. But for this vehicle I'll be using the goldish spring which it calls for on the vehicle revision. But first I'll be installing the idler pulley. Now you want to be sure to torque the bolt to 31 foot-pounds. We can now go ahead and install the tensioner and the spring. Once you got it installed and the bolt tightened by hand, you want to check the operation and make sure that it works properly. You want to use a screwdriver to push down on the tensioner and you want to tighten it. It should make installing the timing belt a lot easier. And now you want to make sure that your timing marks are still properly lined up. This is a better look at the timing mark that you're looking for on the crank gear. And this is the mark that you want to make sure that it lines up with. And this is what the mark should look like when it's lined up properly. Now when installing the timing belt, you want to start at the bottom and work your way up. You want to go around making sure that it installs properly on all the pulleys. If you pull it tight as you install the belt, it helps you avoid the belt coming off from the pulleys you have already placed it on. You want there to be as little slack as possible between the water pump and the camshaft gear. The tensioner will get rid of any other remaining slack. Now you want to verify that the timing marks are still lined up after installing the timing belt. And if they are lined up, you want to loosen the tensioner so it applies tension to the belt. We now want to install the balancer bolt so we can rotate the engine. You only want to rotate the engine clockwise. Rotating the opposite way will cause the gear to jump a tooth. Turn the crankshaft 2 turns clockwise until the crank gear lines up to top dead center. And you want to check to make sure that the cam gear and the crank gear line up properly. Now that we verified the timing belt is on properly, you gotta turn the crankshaft 1 full turn plus a 7/8 turn until it reaches this mark on the housing. So for the next step, we gotta install the lower timing belt cover. But we want to make sure not to forget this piece. After installing the lower cover, we want to install the main pulley as well. So as you can see, we're starting at top dead center. So now we want to do the full turn plus a 7/8 turn until we reach this mark on the housing. Now we can finally go ahead and torque the tensioner pulley. I place it back on top dead center one more time just to verify that everything lines up. Here's what it looks like starting without anything else installed. I won't recommend doing this, but if you do take this step, make sure to avoid the alternator wiring touching any metal and that you torque the harmonic balancer bolt. We can now reinstall everything that was removed. To put tension on the power steering belt, you want to use a screwdriver or a pry bar, and pry the pump away using the engine block to apply tension. Reinstall the upper timing cover plus the bolts. And now the bracket plus the mount. And next the alternator plus the belt. And you don't want to forget about tightening this bracket. And you want to be sure to reconnect all the electrical connections. Now you want to top it up with coolant and run the engine till it warms up to operating temperature. And then let it cool down and top it up again. And once again you want to make sure that you torque your harmonic balancer bolt. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button. It helps support the channel, and don't forget to press that subscribe button if you haven't done so already.